First as finance minister and then as prime minister, Paul Martin has an insider's perspective on the G7. He also played a key role in the creation of the much larger G20. I met with him recently in Montreal to talk about the evolution of these international fora, the kinds of issues to be grappled with now, and the role of Canada. Here's our conversation. When you began work almost 2 decades ago now to create the G20, you saw something missing in what the G7 was able to accomplish on its own. What did you see then?
Well, it's what I didn't see. I was sitting at the table. I didn't see a representative of China or India, two of the largest economies in the world, nor were there a representative of Africa, South America, or the smaller Asian countries. And it's very clear that if you're going to have a body that is going to try to essentially either be a crisis committee or be a steering committee for a much wider number of countries, you've still got to be representative. I think the G7 is a very important body. I think it has an enormous role to play. But fundamentally, without that wider body, you're just simply not representative. And I can, in fact, tell you how I had pushed for the G20 from the very beginning. And the first time I tried was a brand new finance minister, and it didn't work. Nobody was going to listen to somebody who just joined the G7 as a finance minister. But then the Asian crisis hit. And the G7 essentially, we G7 finance ministers essentially told the countries involved in the Asian crisis, which were largely Asian countries, but also Russia, which had a default, and Brazil, which had a devaluation, but telling those Asian countries what they should do. And they came back to it and they said, drop dead. Why would we listen to you? We weren't even at the table. And on the way out of that G7 meeting, I spoke to Larry Summers, who a very good friend of mine, as well as being the U.S. Treasurer, and I said, look, this is the problem the G7 is going to have. There has to be another body. He agreed. We sat down in a room. We put together the list of countries that would be in the G20 between the two of us, and then we went out and spoke to the G7. They agreed because of the Asian crisis, and the G20 was born. I was the first chairman, had the first meeting in Berlin, and I think it's done very well. I think both Gs are very important.
How would you differentiate between what the G7's role now is in this kind of global view and what the G20's role is now?
Well, I think it's the greater representation that is symbolized or is in fact realized by the G20. Mm-hmm. But there are areas where those very large countries, Europe speaking as one, and then obviously Japan, the United States, Canada, as the others. But they really do mesh together very, very well. I'll give you an example. Both have indicated that the G20's idea of a compact with Africa is crucial. And the G7 is, I believe, is supportive of that. Well, what that really means is that you've just got that much more weight behind a concept.
When you look at the kind of, and I hesitate to use the word crisis, but if the G7 and the G20 were born out of very difficult economic times, when we look at what the world is confronting now, the kind of fear there is and uncertainty about what free trade might mean to jobs or what the sort of pace of globalization might mean for people's economic well-being. When we look at that kind of economic difficulty, what role does the G7 need to play in dealing with that kind of economic?
Well, I think we have to understand, you talked about crisis. Change internationally rarely happens without a crisis. So that people talk about issues, they develop the issues, they write about them, they debate them. Countries sometimes try to legislate on them. But internationally, nothing really happens unless there's a crisis which brings it all to a head. And so that the G7, because it is only 7 countries, because they are all powerful economies, when those countries are involved, can act if there has been a crisis. the example that I would give you is that there's obviously a major problem that is now occurring between Europe and the United States as a result of the United States walking away from the Iran agreement, and the question as to whether, in fact, how sanctions are going to apply, and are they going to apply to Europeans who are dealing in that country, and what's the effect in the United States. So they're going to have to deal with this.
That's perhaps the item that's not on the agenda that will be on the agenda at the G7.
I think it has to be, and if it isn't in the official communique, I can tell you right now, it is going to be. If they wrote a communique in the corridors, it would be there.
It's often said that one of the advantages of those kinds of small groups of meetings is the informality. Tell me a bit about how that works.
Well, the most successful meetings are meetings at which there are no cameras, that there is excellent translation so that people can speak in their own language back and forth, and sometimes when there is no agenda. And I'll give you an example of that. One of the most successful G8 meetings that I ever attended as Prime Minister was the Glen Eagles meeting in the United Kingdom, because Tony Blair, who was then Prime Minister, had to leave, and we had to stop the meeting because there had been a bombing in London.
Oh, yes.
So it was totally, you had all these leaders sitting around the table. There was no agenda because we were going to deal with it when Tony Blair came back. And so we just simply talked. And I tell you, in terms of trade, because the head of the WTO was there, one of the best discussions among the leadership that had ever taken place on trade took place at that totally unscheduled, unrehearsed meeting. And those are the important. That's why you'll find that at all of these meetings, at least in my time, dinner is a private event. Nobody else except the leaders. And the conversation in terms of, well, you guys are doing this, what are we going to do here, is really quite, it's quite penetrating in terms of how people get at issues.
It was your friend Larry Summers who said you were very good at addressing the elephant in the room, and I think he was referring to a conversation or a disagreement about agriculture. But if you were going to pick out the elephant in the room for this group of G7 leaders going forward, what do you think it might be?
Oh, I think it probably has to be this issue between the United States and Europe over sanctions
against Iran.
Against Iran, on the Iranian issue.
Right. I
I think that is the one issue that they're going to have to deal with, and that is the body to basically allow that discussion to occur. I would not expect it to be in a communique, but I would not even maybe expect to see it on the official agenda, but let me tell you, it will be on the agenda.
One of the reasons the G7 was seen to be successful was not only because of the economic power of the countries involved, but also because their societies were largely successful, that they had so-called soft power or societal influence. We're looking at political disruption, pretty major political disruption in the United States, in Britain. We've got concerns about the decline of democracy in parts of Europe. How does that affect the potency of what the G7 is able to do you think? Well,
first of all, this is an issue that has been growing. This did not appear on this, on the map yesterday, and it's one that really occurred because of the dramatic increase in the digital economy, the dramatic change on jobs that have disappeared, and the higher education degree to take on the others. And it's also because there are now a number more countries out there who are producing issues, either for the digital, goods, services for the digital economy, and this is a huge change, and also the whole difference in the global supply chain, which is also something that has been coming for the last 10 years, but all of a sudden we're beginning to be realized. So what that's done is cause huge disruptions within the more established economies in Europe and within the United States and elsewhere. And one had to expect that finally we were going to come to grips with this, that what has really happened in so many ways is that people who have, as said, borne the brunt of this change have not been the elites. and the rest of the country, the rest of the world is suddenly, or the rest of these countries are essentially saying, hey, this isn't the way it's supposed to be.
If the G7 is among the elite, in fact, of the countries in the world, can the G7 grapple with those kinds of issues, and will people pay attention? Much the same way that, as you said, leading up to the G20, people were saying the G7 or the G8 is going to tell us what to do?
Well, no, but the truth of the matter is, when I was referring to the elites earlier,
yeah,
I wasn't referring to those countries as the elites. I was referring to the elites within those countries.
Right.
Because to be honest, the G7 no longer represents the elites. The G20 does much more because, in fact, and that's the change that's occurring within the world.
Yeah. I wanted to run past you an assessment from the economist Danny Roderick, who says we cannot simultaneously pursue democracy, national determination, and economic globalization, which, in sort of various forms, these international organizations have to deal with. Is he right?
Well, I have huge respect for him, huge respect for him. I've been at discussions with him and other people, but I don't agree. The fact is that, first of all, globalization has changed fundamentally. The digital economy is a growing part of it that didn't exist before. The global supply chains that I talked to you. So globalization is a fact of life. It's not going away. It is there. It changes its colors, and that is what is in the process of happening. But to sort of say that things like democracy or sound economies are incompatible with globalization, I don't agree. Globalization is a fact of life, and you're not going to walk away from it. We live in an era where climate change, which is a social issue, has massive economic consequences. We also live in a world where the 2008 recession, which was an economic catastrophe, had huge social consequences. So there is no distinction to bring between them. Globalization is globalization. It changes its code, but the fact is we've got to make it work. And I don't believe to say that you can't have globalization, democracy, and decent economy at the same time. That can't be the way the world has got to work. That's what the G7 and the G20 have to deal with.
I was going to say, as globalization changes its colors, which is a nice way to put it, how do those international organizations, then those loosely knit groups of people, how do they have to change? How do they have to adapt to that kind of reality and the fear and uncertainty that we hear from people in some of those countries?
They have to recognize it. And that is the problem that occurred, that for so long, so many of these countries essentially did not recognize what was happening to people. I mean, so the 2008 recession, which is really, an event that had far greater consequence than I think most people say. What happened in too many governments is that they ignored what was happening to people down here, because the people up here were not being affected all that much, and that's what's happened. And the advantage of having a G7 or a G20 is that they now understand it and they now have to deal with it, and I think they recognize that.
Is it something that can be dealt with in sort of that multinational forum?
Yes, it won't be dealt with in a communique,
yeah.
But yes, it will be. And that's where we go back to the conversations that we were having before, when people face up to this kind of thing. Unfortunately, it takes a bit of time, and you wish it didn't, I wish that it didn't. But 9 times out of 10, this kind of change requires something quite significant, which they'll say a crisis, to recognize that people have finally got to move, and then they move, and it takes longer than what you think. But there's no doubt in my mind that people are in the process of dealing with those issues. And there's no doubt that it's been slowed down very heavily by what is happening in the United States. But I do believe that the world is going to deal with these issues.
I want to ask you a little bit about Canada's role. I mean, not only is Canada hosting the G7, but Prime Minister Trudeau, and I mean, even at the time of your government, you talked about Canada playing a bigger role on the international stage, and harken back to the role that Canada played in the 1960s. Realistically, what role do you think Canada can be playing?
I think we can play a very important role, and it goes back to your earlier question. So often, the issue isn't what are we going to do. We know what we have to do. The real issue is how are we going to get it done? And a country like Canada, which is not one of the great economic powers, but is a highly respected country, can work at how do we get it done. That really is the dealing with individual country by individual country. How do we overcome these kinds of issues? We don't talk about how do we get things done. We talk about what do we have to do. I think we know what we have to do, but somebody has got to take the lead on how do we get it done. That doesn't necessarily have to be, or maybe it cannot be, one of the great economic powers, but it can be Canada.
Is that, I mean, you're talking about it in the terms of the current sort of global context, but we're looking at a situation now where the United States has traditionally taken that kind of leadership role, and it appears now that it does not want to play that kind of international leadership role. Apart from Canada, where should we be looking for that leadership?
Well, I think first of all, we should be looking to Canada, but I think that we've got to look at the other countries. I think that one of the most important things that happened within the G20 was that when the United States withdrew from the climate change agreement, had the G20 flinched, then I would not be as confident I am, but it didn't flinch. It said, we're continuing with climate change. And that means that there will become a time when the United States will recognize that it has to deal with it, as there will be a time when all countries will recognize they have to deal with the dying oceans. And I think that Canada can play a very important role when that happens.
Thank you very much for your insight.
Thank you.